All right,
Just
we
I
are
have
live. So, welcome to Write Better Stories. My name is Daniel Backer. This is my co-host Pringle, and joining me today is my second guest, but my first guest who has COVID, Rick Homuth.
yes. Well, it's wonderful to be here, ladies and germs. And this is the first time I've had to sound intelligent in a long time. It's also the first time I've had a conversation with anybody in fucking 2 weeks. So this is exciting. I'm interested to see how it's going to go.
So we don't do intelligence here. You don't have to worry about that. So
that is a great relief.
Yeah. Basically, Rick is a friend of mine that I know from high school, but also a talented and accomplished writer. And to be honest, I have to confess, I don't know if I've ever actually encountered your plays. I know you write plays and had one in the Fringe Festival, but I've definitely read a lot of your Hard Times articles. And so,
yes, I am.
Yeah, so let's chat about your plays in a second, but let's start out. Talk to me a little bit about like how you got involved with the Hard Times, and let me know.
Well, I think probably 5 or 6 years ago, when it was just getting off the ground, people started sending me articles, and they'd say things like, "Boy, I can't believe you didn't write this," or "This reminds me of something you would say," and I was like, "Shit, well, if that's the case, can I swear? Is that all right?"
I mean, this isn't monetized, so.
Okay. I mean, I'll keep it to a minimum, I guess, as much as I can. But so I thought, this would be a great thing to do myself, and I just, sent the guy an email. And at that point, it just very recently got off the ground. It was like maybe a year into its existence, and all you had to do was send 10 pitches, which I mean, I guess now that I think about it, that's still what all you have to do to get in. And Matt, the editor-in-chief at the time, liked some of my ideas and just let me into the big online writers room, which is just a Facebook group, and went from there. And so, I really like that structure. It, in true punk rock fashion, I guess, gives a lot of non-writers, people who, don't have any of that sort of infrastructure in their lives to get into a creative writing, get any publishing, to get a exposure to that, which I really liked. It's not like getting a job at The Simpsons or something where you have to go to Harvard and know all those people, or it's just generations of comedic hegemony,
Right.
And so, yeah, and getting to meet all those people online was really cool, because so many of them were like me and just has exposure to the very esoteric subculture of DIY punk and hardcore, but also liked making dick and fart jokes. And it was a very, very good niche for me, and continues to be, although I guess I write less now than I did then.
Okay, very cool. So I know that this is like a terrible question, but something that I've gotten in notes on my writing before is when somebody's like, you should put a joke in this part. And the way that I think of it is like any funny parts that show up in my writing just kind of come out of thin air. I don't, it's not like you're sitting there with a little humor equation and then a joke pops out. So I am curious, like, are the headlines of these articles or the content inside of them, is it something that just kind of like pops in your head when you're in the shower, or do you have like a work process in order to generate content for like satirical articles?
I think the bulk of them are just apparitions, I think I've always been the sort of, and this is another sort of silly thing to say, but I think I'm just an off the cuff funny guy. And I say that because I think there are a lot of people, and I didn't really realize this until I started spending time with actual like comedy writers and people who like did stand up and stuff like that, who would sit down with a notebook and write jokes, and write out a set. And they're really very diligent about that. And that had just never really been my process, right? Like, the kid cracking jokes in your high school classroom is probably not sitting there the night before and while he should be doing his homework, coming up with things to say and other kids to call gay or fat or whatever. Like, that's just not how it works. And And so once I saw people doing that and kind of learned about their processes, I started doing that myself. And, there's a lot of different moments where if a current event happens, then one of the editors will say, okay, so this is happening, like Trump did this or whatever it is, let's come up with some ideas. And then you sort of have to start generating ideas off the cuff then. I have a lot of success with that as well. So in terms of, my writing process, I think I'm sure I would be better served if I sat down with a notebook the way some people did. But and so, I guess that's just an ongoing development, if that answers your question at all.
Oh, no, it definitely does. Yeah. Cause I've just struggled with that. And I'm not definitely not somebody who is pursuing comedy per se, but I did do a lot of like improv in Chicago, and I got to meet Bob Odenkirk when he came to DePaul. And
I think you told me about that. Yeah.
yeah, oh, I mean, it was just so cool. Just like after seeing Mr. Show and like Tim and Eric, which he helped realize and everything. But he was somebody that recommended that, like, get a notebook and do 10 jokes a day. And I think I tried it for maybe 2 or 3 days. So like I don't think I really had the longevity for it, but it was really challenging. And I don't think that like on either of the days, not that I really gave it a serious go, I don't think like one of the 10 was very good, because it made me think that I was just like sitting there trying to come up with something that's spontaneous. Whereas like when I approach fiction, it's something that like there's not necessarily the intended reaction of laughter, and so there's kind of like more possibilities there. So with jokes, that's something that's like super hard, in my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's so there for a long time it felt sort of wrong to workshop a joke, like just come up with a funny concept and sit there and pull it apart, like with an editor, say, and be like, oh, well, I think it's funnier if you do this, or if we approach it at this angle, or in this article, like maybe if you quote somebody like this. And I'm somebody who I guess has always had a hard time, responding to criticism, I suppose. And I think one of my biggest issues or roadblocks as a writer is, coming up with something and then writing it down and creating it, which, is a pain in the ass as it is, and then sharing it with somebody else, and they say, well, I don't know about this or this or this. And I'm just like, well, what am I supposed to do? I'm done, and the stakes are a little lower with, funny 400-word fake articles, but that also is an ongoing process, I suppose.
That is the thing. Yeah. And I think you've got to be really selective with like who you ask for notes, because I've definitely struggled with that in the past, thinking that like I just want to give this to anybody who will say yes and get their feedback on it. And like I think the way I justified it is that like even if this person isn't a writer or doesn't care about the craft, their raw reaction to it will be just what I need. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I run into that sometimes with my theater work. Not to switch gears here.
No, go ahead.
Early, but I think the person I probably, lob ideas back and forth with and workshop theater stuff is Charlie, my friend Charlie Whitecamp, who we also went to high school with, who lives in Kansas City and does a lot of DIY theater stuff. He produced my first show, Neighborhood Goons, and I owe him a great deal of debt in every regard. But he, in his sort of theatrical interests, is a lot more experimental and a lot more willing to eschew sort of tradition of what it means to have a stage piece. He was very into dance and sound design and just sort of the fringes of what makes theater as a distinct work, And I've always been, I don't want to say more traditional, because that seems like a sort of a strange thing to say, but more willing to work in the confines of, what is expected, I suppose. I mean, some of my favorite plays are just family dramas, or the more classic, like Arthur Miller style, or, even Neil Simon slapstick, satire stuff. Like, I really like the structure of traditional theater. And so a lot of the things I write kind of mirror that, not in subject matter or language or anything, but, my first show, Neighborhood Goons, was a comedy of errors in an almost Shakespearean tradition. even though it was about people getting drunk and fighting each other. And so he, I'll send him something and I'll be like, oh, what do you think of this? And he'll be like, yeah, I mean, I like it, but what if it just took this crazy turn with a ghost and an apparition and so, we're so locked in sync in so many ways artistically, but it just goes to show you that, even the person who you may be most spiritually attuned as a writer, you still don't necessarily like what they have to say all the time, because of your backgrounds, I suppose.
Oh yeah, I mean it kind of made me think of that. They say that like a successful marriage of people in their 80s, it's not the absence of arguments, but it's the lightheartedness of arguments that happen.
I guess
So
that's,
like
yeah.
I think in a collaboration you kind of need that, and it's just that's resonating with like collaborations that I've had, but then just in hearing other people talk about their creative collaborators is that it's very rare that you'll hear people describe just like being on the same page 100% of the time, unless they're like brothers. I feel like sometimes like brother director teams, probably just because they grew up in the same house with like the same media diet and sensibility, that they can just like develop this thing. But that tension's interesting though. But I wanted to ask, so can you recall at some point in you seeing theater or doing theater that there was a play that made you feel like you gravitated more toward that medium rather than like fiction or film?
I don't know if there was a single epiphanic episode where I saw something and knew that was to be my calling. I think, I was involved in theater in high school, but even then, I think was more interested in the improv side of things half the time. But I think just over the course of my development as an aspiring writer, there's something about sitting and looking at that blank page that I'm sure all writers face, where it's just so daunting, right? And if you're writing fiction, like a short story to a novel or anything in between, the possibilities are just endless, right? Like the way you start and who speaks and what you describe, and just anything under the sun. Theater is a medium of limits. There's the only thing that you can do is what can conceivably be put on a stage and enacted by real people.
That's true.
So in doing that, it narrows that canvas immediately, and you are limited to time and space in a way that I think makes it easier to focus. And a parallel I like to draw is, I think the times, a lot of writers talk about what they would do if they didn't have to work, or if they could just go on a writer's retreat, or just get paid to sit there and write all the time. And I understand that, but I also think about the times where I have been the least productive as a writer have been when I've just had endless swaths of free time. Yep. And no excuse not to write, like maybe a global pandemic or something. Sure. And some of the times I've had the most success was when I was working weird hours or a 9-to-5 job, and you have to force an hour and a half of writing here and there in the morning or in the evening. And that structure, to me as a person, I find very useful. And I think there's a parallel to writing theater as well, where, you have to play by certain rules of what can and cannot exist. And I find that useful and comforting, and sometimes in writing.
Yeah, I definitely I get that, because there are times, because I'm obviously more interested in fiction, but in doing like several drafts of a project, there are a lot of times where I'm like, I just kind of wish people could ignore like the style of the prose, because like sometimes I'll like send something out for notes and people will be like, this sentence sounds a little awkward, and I'm like, yeah, but like what about the story and the characters and like what about these choices, you know what I mean? And so
Mm-hmm.
that is, I think, kind of frustrating with fiction, is that there are just like so many little parameters that makes it the medium of what it is. Because even though drama is obviously like literature, you're right, it is understood to be the thing that gets you on stage in order to have that production. So like, I guess, does that ever feel daunting to you, just from a production standpoint, of knowing that this is like that it's kind of like a halfway stage, because just to project like my own feelings is that that's something that I got frustrated with in writing for film, is that it was just such like, and this is more true of film than drama, but it just felt like the script was like a formality. And so like we'd spend time on the script and then it would all just go out the window due to production constraints. So like how does that feel to you from a drama perspective?
It's definitely different. And I will say, the first time I had words that I had written down recited in front of me, it was about, I don't know, 2 weeks out before, opening night. And I was watching these actors, very skilled, they were grad students in theater, who had diligently worked to rehearse their lines, and they were saying it out loud. And I was just there like, this is not what it looked like in my head, and
Sure.
what you're looking at in your head is not a real thing. It's just this, conglomeration of your ideal situation, right? And it's every perfect moment that your subconscious has come up with, and then you have to see it, and it's, they've been working on it for, the better part of 3 months, and you want to change everything and tell somebody to go against their instincts, and you kind of just have to grit your teeth and let the director do it. That's very interesting. I kind of envy, the way a lot of filmmakers get to work with scenarios instead of just a script, right? Where, a lot of film people, certainly that I know, have just an idea of what they want to get across in a scene. And, they just tell the actors, like, here's what you should say it as naturally as you can. And then we'll do it until we get it, and that seems like a very, appealing way to go about creating art, I suppose. And you can't really do that when you've got a room full of 100 odd people waiting for them all to deliver this polished performance. And I think this is a sort of a tangent as well, but I've been watching a lot of movies now under quarantine, and I've never really been a movie guy before, but the playwright Martin McDonagh, who wrote The Pillow Man, who Justin talked about a lot in high school.
Yeah.
Great play, great dark comedy. He did a movie called Three Billboards Outside Ebbings, Missouri. Came out 2017. Sam Rockwell, Woody Harrelson, and Frances McDormand, I think her name is, the lady from Fargo. And I hated it. It was terrible. And you could just tell that he was a playwright, right? Because everybody who was reading, who was saying their lines, you could tell was reciting them word for word off of a page, right? Mm-hmm. And, I'm sure as a script, it looked very well and it read very nicely. And all the lines that he had created were clever and polished and smart and told a compelling story. But the way it transferred to film just didn't work. And, a character played by Woody Harrelson would never say this sort of thing, right? And it just fell so flat to me. And I think that happens a lot with playwrights who write for film, because just that transition isn't as seamless as people expect it to be. And the movie won 1 billion Oscars too. I didn't understand it, but I think that's a common pitfall.
Yeah, no, I get that. I guess I can't think of many adaptations off the top of my head of like drama to film, but I think that it's just like commonly acknowledged that in theater, like the line between melodrama and realism can be blurred a little bit more, and that's kind of why people go to the theater, not in any bad way. And then musicals would be like a hyper version of that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that has a very fraught history as well. Like so many musicals that have been adapted for film, are very technically polished and are good products, but like Les Mis, for example, was not well received as I understand it, based on it, what it was as a stage piece, because all they did was they took the script and then they had people do it and sing the songs and do everything in front of a camera, right? And it just doesn't work the same way. But if you look at something like Chicago, which came out in 2006 maybe, and I think really was responsible for the resurgence in film adaptations of musicals. And I think that won some sort of award, so Oscar or something too. It adapted the stage musical in a way that, you know, used the film capabilities as an asset instead of just recording something that already existed. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but basically they break away. It's about, you know, this jazz club in Chicago in the 20s. You know, all the musical numbers are sort of, they take place in an area, a sort of ethereal space, a liminal space separate from the actual narrative on a literal stage. But because it all takes place in a, you know, a jazz club with a stage, like a cabaret, it makes sense. I don't know if I'm describing this very well, but.
Are you saying that like the musical numbers take place like on a theater stage in the film?
Yes. So,
okay.
For example, one of the characters played by John C. Reilly is sort of the hapless nitwit of a husband of one of the female characters who's cheating on him and lies to him about, you know, murdering the guy she's cheating on him with, and he gets wrapped up as sort of this patsy and is just this big goofball the whole time. And he has a musical number where he sings about how much of a stooge he is. And
is that Mr. Cellophane?
Yeah, exactly. And he's dressed up as like a clown and kind of does these little, you know, jazz movements, and it makes sense. You know, it's not, you know, it works with the suspension of disbelief that people expect from a stage piece, because, you know, I think there's a much more accelerated suspension of disbelief when you're in a literal theater, because, you know, you can look to your left and to your right and see other people sitting in a room in front of people wearing costumes saying lines. And you have to sort of sign a contract that says, all right, this is strange and unreal, but for the purpose of this play, we buy into that. And it doesn't necessarily work the same way on film, because you're in a, you know, you're watching something on a screen with CGI or, you know, more sophisticated costumes or technology that can deliver a more convincing, you know, fake thing.
Yeah, that is true. I think that I'll say for myself, but I think this is pretty common. It's like I'm pretty unforgiving if something, even like a tiny little thing, one line delivery doesn't feel very realistic in a film. Whereas like, yeah, in a play, you kind of go into that knowing that it's going to be heightened, and it's not like realism is just one of the many things that it could go for.
Yeah.
That's cool. Okay, so you'd mentioned earlier that you and Charlie come from these different sensibilities of more experimental versus more structural. So I'm like, I guess I'm wondering, how does that apply to film for you? Are you somebody that likes like Kubrick and David Lynch and all these kind of auteur guys, or do you like Horrible Bosses? And I love Horrible Bosses, by the way. Like for a commercial comedy, I think it's a very good movie. But
well, I don't know if I would pick Horrible Bosses as my parallel. I suppose if the one side of the spectrum is Kubrick and Lynch, who, you know, both of whom I like a great deal, the other end is 12 Angry Men or something that's very straight, guys in a room talking, you know, something that's basically just a stage play in front of a camera, if you think about it.
I see what you mean. Sure.
I'm trying to think of what a good boy, the last movie I saw that I really, really liked was Uncut Gems, by, you know, two brothers, I suppose, to go back to what you were saying earlier. And I don't think that counts to me as what would be a straightforward, traditional, dramatic film, right? You know, it doesn't have any sort of disjointed narrative or time. It doesn't play with time or any way, but I fucking love it. You know, like, my friend Tanner and I have been watching all of Vincent Gallo's movies lately, because he is just a cretin, but we're just so fascinated by him. I don't know if you've ever seen any of his work, like Buffalo
I know
66.
his name. What are some examples of Vincent Gallo movies?
His big movie was Buffalo 66. He starred opposite Christina Ricci. That was like 96, I think. And he did this movie called The Brown Bunny in 2003 with Chloe Sevigny, which is notable for its use of unsimulated blowjob towards the end. And you get to see his DGing est. And
I'm I've been waiting for that.
You know, Roger Ebert said it was the worst movie that ever debuted at Cannes, whole thing. But he's another example of somebody, he's also a terrible guy, like super right-wing, big Trump guy, just vile human. But so we're so fascinated in him as an artist because, you know, I think all of his characters, you know, pluck from within him a certain, I don't want to say self-loathing, but understanding of his more malignable characteristics. And again, doesn't really play with the liminal, subliminal, superliminal, whatever Lynchian words you want to use. Yeah.
Okay, I get that. And I think Uncut Gems is an interesting example too, because I am kind of shocked at how polarizing I've seen that movie and or just the reactions to that movie, because like this was just one of those movies that I like sitting in the theater watching it for the first time. I was like jealous that I had nothing to do with it. Not that like I ever would have, you know, been in that position, but it's because some stuff you just enjoy, it blows you away. But this was just like, oh, this is just like, God, what a cool thing that came out. And then even a lot of people that I know that are like film buffs ended up not liking it because they said it was like, it was so stressful and so loud and everybody talking all over each other that they just like couldn't get into it. And so that just made me think like, obviously it's subjective and people have their different opinions, but that just seemed like a wrong opinion. Like
it was, I have a theory on this. So that movie did very poorly with the subtitle crowd, which is kind of a group of people who put subtitles on everything. Like, you know, and I think this cast of media consumers developed in concurrence with Netflix really becoming the dominant, you know, way that people consume TV and film, as not as something you sit down in a theater to watch or, you know, get your popcorn, we're doing a movie night, turn the lights off, we're watching a movie, but just something that's in the background at all times when you just occupy free time, you know, when you're Netflix or chilling, or, you know,
or cooking something or.
Yeah, right. Like, and you have these options to like put things on Netflix at like 1.5 speed or whatever. And, you know, I'm not some ideological purist who hates that stuff. I don't get it, but I think, you know, Uncut Gems, like you said, everybody's talking over each other at the same time. So you can't watch it with subtitles because you don't know what to read. And I think the kind of person who likes watching movies with subtitles necessarily cares less about it as an art piece because, you know, you have these big gaudy letters at the bottom of the screen and you're not watching what's happening or any of the photography, you're watching the words being said in front of you. It rubs them the wrong way just because there's a sort of dissonance with how they want to watch movies and consume media, I suppose. Just something I've noticed, I suppose.
Yeah, I get that because even some of the way that like the narrative information is doled out in Uncut Gems is a little indirect. That like I forget his name, but the guy who kidnaps him at his daughter's play.
Oh yeah, Eric Bogosian's character.
And then he ends up like being part of the family, and like that kind of took a moment for me to register, which is I felt like really interesting storytelling. Is that he's introduced just as this guy that Adam Sandler's character owes money to, and then he's at their like ritual celebration later. I forget the holiday that it was.
Yeah, they're at like a Seder or something.
Yeah, but within like a more kind of traditional movie, there would be some sort of thing telegraphing to the audience, like, "Hey, this guy is in the family." Like, just in
don't
case.
worry, yeah, like you're not going to be. We're not going to ask too much of you, you know.
Yeah.
And you know, it's like, you know, there's a sensibility. So some people would like to watch the movie and are excited to see that unfurl. Some people are going to nudge the person next to them and be like, who's that guy? We've never seen him before. Why is he saying this thing? I don't get it. You know, It sounds like I'm being some sort of snob here. And I really don't mean to come across that way, but it's just so interesting the way that, you know, the instant streaming platforms we have available to us have changed our expectations. You know, and I'm not even a big movie theater guy. Like I'm just not even a big movie guy, period. But I suppose I would, if I had to classify myself, I'm firmly anti-subtitle.
I get that. Yeah. Well, because yeah, I think it's like because I probably pretty liberally choose and interchange between like movies, drama, fiction, and all that kind of thing. And I get that like each of their mediums kind of colors the possibilities there, but just with like storytelling in general, I'm always interested in knowing something that like you kind of have to connect using just your observation skills. And so like something that came to my mind as we were talking about this is like The Shining. And I'm sure you're familiar with like all the conspiracy theories that are associated with The Shining, right?
Yeah.
And so like this isn't uncommon knowledge at all, but like one of my complaint with a lot of these conspiracy theories or it's just that it's like they seem to distract and depart more and more from what the movie actually does want us to pay attention to. You know,
Yeah.
it's like in the case of Uncut Gems, it's this kind of sly, indirect way of establishing important information to the film by having the guy hound him for money and then reveal that he's a family member. Whereas, like, when we're to believe that for The Shining, it's some sort of admission about the moon landing or about the treatment of the Native Americans, it's like, I kind of believe that you can connect those dots and you couldn't completely like it's not a falsifiable thing to say that it's
Mhm.
about the moon landing or about the Native Americans, but like so little about the actual narrative action of The Shining is about the moon landing or the Native Americans that it like I just it's fun. I'm not going to take people's fun away, but at the same time, it makes me feel pretty comfortable in just being like I don't think it's there.
Yeah. Have you seen Eyes Wide Shut?
I have, yeah.
I watched that for the first time recently, and it's the same thing where there's all these different conspiracies about, oh, why did he name this street this, or why can you see this headline in this shot? Certainly very deliberate choices that he made. But yeah, there is a certain, you know, uh, there's something to be said for just accepting them as strange images meant to stir something within you and not solvable puzzles. Another thing about that movie, just to tie in what I was saying earlier about
Sure.
subtitle people and you know authorship, I suppose. I caught myself kind of being trained to expect, something different than what I think he created. So you only see the famous sort of like orgy scene once, where Tom Cruise goes to this lavish palatial estate, and everybody's got the masks on, and there's the Gregorian chants, and everything's very creepy, and he leaves eventually, and it's a pretty long movie. It's almost like 2.5 hours or something. But when it ended, I was surprised. I was like, well, shit, don't we go back to the orgy and see who was there? And don't we get this big reveal? And don't all their masks come off? And isn't there going to be a car chase or something? Like, I caught myself sort of serializing it in my head. And I, once I figured out, I was like, oh, yeah, I guess not. I mean, I guess I've been sitting here for 2.5 hours. I was very content and enjoyed the movie a lot. But it just kind of went to show where people's expectations are at these days. Or maybe I'm just projecting an incredible deal. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily say these days, but definitely I think we are trained in a lot of ways to expect the kind of neat and tidy reveal. And that's always something that I go back and forth on because I do like movies that end things with some ambiguity and they don't really, wrap everything up all neat and tidy. But then two, I think some stuff kind of like jumps the railroad tracks and becomes so abstract and so experimental that it kind of departs from what justifies a 2 hour viewing experience or a 2.5 hour viewing experience that like and Stanley Kubrick I think is the most guilty of this. And I have finally admitted to myself I don't think I love Stanley Kubrick. I do like a lot of his stuff, and there are like moments in I think every one of his films that I've seen that I just think are amazing. But I think as like a whole, from a writing perspective and a storytelling perspective, I always have qualms about them. That like and like for Eyes Wide Shut, for that as an example, like it is cool, but I just think overall some of like the characters almost seem like they're supposed to represent these types and these like symbols of like man and woman in marriage and contemporary society, that it kind of like leaves the discrete details that make characters come to life, it kind of leaves those out. And so
Mhm.
that's where like my frustration with him kind of comes in. And again, like there, I can't look away when I'm watching a movie by him, but just the story in them always kind of leaves something lacking because it's so involved in its own like symbolism and theme and camera work that it kind of leaves some of the
There
story
is an
behind.
uncanniness to the people and what they say and do.
Yeah,
That is, yeah, I know what you mean.
yeah. So I don't know. I just like I worry about that. But I guess then from like a dramatic perspective, when you're beginning a play or a story or something like that, what is like the first thing that you do when you're, like you said, staring onto that blank piece of paper? Are you coming up with a concept? Is there a character, a setting?
Well, I suppose anytime that I find myself staring at that blank page because I've said to myself, today I want to write something, nothing happens. Bupkis, right? But
rumble it up and throw it. That's the first.
Talk it up to a
I'm
loss.
Put Pringle in this chair real quick.
Yeah, go put your Pringles away. Oh, that's his whole chair, huh? Wow.
He's royalty around here.
I love it.
Sitting back there.
There
you go.
There you go. When I do have success, if I have success, it's because I've had some sort of idea gestating already. If I've come up with an image or an interaction that I want to see or explore, or a conversation, because what are plays if not just hour and a half long arguments? And so I think, what I'll do is I'll sit there and just sort of explore that and try and build off of that. And hopefully a greater concept emerges from that, or some sort of, other jumping off point to pursue. I don't think of myself as somebody who has the ability to create something out of nothing. I wish I was. I would be a lot happier with my output and production levels, but I think there's got to be some spark in order to get something down on the page. So to answer your question, if I do find myself, what gets me writing is something, that I've already come up with, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know how helpful that is.
Yeah. So it's not just like, hey, let's see what happens. What do we got on the old pen today?
Yeah, right.
That makes sense. Well, what you said about that being an argument, I thought was interesting too. Are you somebody that has arguments in your head? Because that is something I definitely relate to. I guess most people probably do that, but
I have arguments with every single person in my life. And does that count? Arguments in my head? I don't know. I agree with myself most of the time. So
okay.
Not as much. Yeah. I'm pretty confident in my beliefs. I don't need to learn anything really.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. Because I'm definitely somebody that I have arguments in my head constantly of just like either with people or just with like, what about this though? Yeah, but what about this? What about this? So like I think sometimes a lot in like dialogue that does come out a lot. But I guess it's the same mentality though. If you're having arguments with people, this is coming from kind of like an authentic place.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. So recently I gave you my manuscript. What's your favorite part of my manuscript? Shower me with praise.
Well, I did tell you that it reminded me of that Joy Williams story. And it occurred to me that you need a subscription to the Paris Review, which is a CIA front anyway. So, you could just chuck that idea out the window.
Joy.
I'll have to see if I could find another PDF for you or something. But yeah, I mean, I like the character of Lionel a lot. I mean, I certainly see, a lot of, he is a sort of brain poisoned young lad who likes watching a lot of the atheist owned videos that I found myself enjoying a lot in high school when I was much less sufferable of a person. Oh, he's back. And so, yeah, I mean, I think he's just a very vivid character and the sort who, I think, when you write unlikable characters, I found myself reading things where I'm just like, I don't want to spend any more time with this person in this book or whatever. I'm gonna put it down. But I think Lionel has a lot of success so far in making me invested in what he's doing and how he's doing it and why. If only to get a glimpse into my own self in some ways.
Well, that's great. Well, and thank you for answering the totally pimped compliment that I back to.
I am not finished with it, I will say. So maybe I'll change my mind.
Oh, that's right. He gets really likable at the end, and then it just like totally ruins it.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, where do you think that leaves us for this interview conversation? Do you have anything that's been on your mind that you're reading? Do you have any questions for me? Do you have any?
Well, what have I been reading? I've honestly been reading a lot of politics and history and nonfiction lately, which we don't need to get into. But I've been going over all my old Nelson Algren books, just because I end up doing that, every year, every other year, even when there's not a global pandemic. Been reading Yukio Mishima, if you're familiar. He was I think the last notable Japanese figure to commit seppuku. He tried to take over a Japanese army base in I don't even want to guess, but he kind of had raised a small militia and tried to inspire a right-wing coup, and it didn't take. So he committed ritual suicide. But he's a very interesting figure. He sort of fancied himself a Japanese James Dean in the post-World War II period in Japan. So I've been reading a lot of his stuff, and it's all very meditative, and it's good reading for when you can't go anywhere and you'd have no place to be, I suppose. What else do I got here? Yeah, this guy, Reynaldo Arenas. I found one of his books. Cuban guy, queer author from the 80s who emigrated to America, and writes about what it was like in Cuba in the decades after the revolution. So that's been interesting as well. Boy, I'm just looking around for books.
Well, I mean, that's plenty to work with. I'm curious though, like, where do you find the books that you're going to read next? Because there are so many options.
A lot of them are recommended to me. Spring Snow by Yukio Mishima was recommended to me by my ex-girlfriend, actually. And I think Reynaldo Arenas, somebody gave me this book because I was looking at it at their apartment and thought it was interesting. I have just everybody has just an infinite list of books that they need to read. I think right now I just am forcing myself to read fiction, and I'm not one of those people who saw the world begin to collapse around him and was like, what use is there living in these fantasy worlds? It's meaningless. But I think to an extent, with the election and subsequent ousting of Donald Trump and the pandemic and just the hellhole we all find ourselves living in, I have found a bit more of a practical application in, reading about history and theory, and not theory, but politics. I've been reading, now that I'm, writing a little more, I've been reading more theater as well. This guy, Bruce Norris, who is actually a Chicago guy I really like. I saw his play Downstate at the Steppenwolf Theater a couple of years ago, and it was just, it didn't change my life, but it was one of those moments where I was just like, Jesus Christ. And I went back to see it again, twice, and I really liked that. It was about these 4 sex offenders who live in like government subsidized housing in downstate Illinois.
You told me about that when I was up in Chicago. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it is another work I would classify as straight theater, where it takes place in one setting, right? Where it's the living room, their communal space in this house. and it takes place over the course of 2 days, broken up by intermission. And it just really scratches my itch. I am just so tantalized by weaving these intricate plot lines and having them tie together, and just these different gut punches.
You're also a sex offender, right?
Right. And I after a long day of knocking on my neighbors' doors, letting them know I moved in, I just like to
get some representation over here.
Yeah, exactly. No, and I mean, I do get some interesting looks when I tell people about this show and how it's one of my favorite things I've ever seen, because it literally humanizes pedophiles, right? And that's disgusting, isn't it? But I think it deals with it so skillfully, and also doesn't approach a resolution, right? Like, all the characters, one of them is a victim of one of the people who lives in the house, who comes back to sort of try and have this not an accountability process necessarily, but air his grievances in a way that will help him cope with his abuse as a victim, and his wife. And they both have different sort of monologues about what they believe the nature of justice to be, and how these guys' lives have clearly been ruined, and they just live in misery practically. And people throw things through their windows and give them death threats all day, but how that also isn't enough, right? For the man and his wife who have come here for some sort of closure, and see that almost everything you have to take away from these people has been taken away, and that still isn't enough to heal. And just in a time when our societal dialogue centers so much on justice and incarceration and what that means, it doesn't feel the need to provide an answer. And I appreciate when pieces of art do that, I suppose. I think there's still a lot there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a heavy topic. That's just one of those things that, like,
yeah, no doubt.
Because, like, I believe that it's good, but I'm just like, anything that's such a radioactive subject matter like that, I think my predisposition is a little bit like, oh, well, is it sensational just for the point of, like, shock and awe? But obviously, like, that's territory to be explored,
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think maybe the worst version of that is, like, in creative writing classes, when someone turns in a story about serial killers.
Yeah.
That it's like
there's always the guy who wants to write about rape or something. Like,
yeah.
We've been in that room. It's very uncomfortable.
Oh, it is. Yeah. Well, and, like, beyond just how uncomfortable it is, it's also just funny that that's what they think that literature is literature is rape.
Yeah.
Or like, literature is someone with a bloodlust who wants to paint the room with blood.
You need to come up with the most dramatic, violent concept, and that will be interesting, right? Like, that is the most dramatic thing possible, has to be the most extreme thing, right?
Yeah.
And not to but this is something I observed when I was watching Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, is like, there was just this one scene where the characters keep one-upping each other with horrifying statements about, like, the central character's daughter had been killed and raped and murdered, and she was trying to get to the bottom of it. And her abusive ex-husband comes back, and it's just like, our daughter's dead. I beat you. She said she wanted to live with me. You're having sex with a 19-year-old. Like, and it's this argument or this conversation of escalatingly dramatic things, but just because you say them doesn't mean it's compelling, I guess, right? And, poor Martin McDonough kind of reminded me of that guy in the creative writing class, where just because you come up with an idea that is heinous and despicable and stomach turning, and it evokes the sort of visceral reaction, does not make that good. Like, there's got to be more substance, got to be more juice.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that is good about a lot of family drama plays in general. Obviously, those get into some pretty dicey subject matter, but it is kind of cool knowing that just, like, a room with a group of people who know each other is enough to, like, evoke those feelings, that you don't necessarily need those big things. I have similar thoughts on stories that deal with suicide or end in suicide,
Mhm.
because it's just like, not that you shouldn't do it, like, you can explore that if you'd like, but sometimes it seems like it's a move that could be a stand-in for a more delicate way of evoking some kind of emotional response from the audience.
I was in a writers group, just some friends of mine, a couple of years ago, and I submitted a story where somebody died at the end, and one of the people in the group said, in my creative writing class, they told us not to write stories that ended with somebody dying because it's usually a stand-in for a more dramatic or compelling option, right? Like, when you resort to those sort of cliches, you rob yourself of the opportunity to create something more novel, I suppose. And that was another moment where I was like, all right, that's it. I'm done. I'm never writing again.
I'm out.
All right.
Yeah.
What do you want from me? But, I think there is something to that.
Well, yeah, because it's like ideally the end of the story is supposed to answer all of the little threads that you've put together and tie them in some way, even if you are going for an ambiguous ending. So yeah, if they die, unless you like really naturally led to that, it can just be kind of like well, that's an end, like not much further to go from here. So now
Yeah.
they're literally dead. All right. So I mean, we're approaching about an hour. Do you have any final words or anything that you've been working on you want to talk about here at the end?
Well, I am working on a family drama right now. I won't say too much about it just because it won't, I am trying to deal with things that are not gut punchingly dramatic. And so for that reason, they're kind of boring to talk about. But it's a shame because my plan for 2020 was get a play produced in Chicago. That didn't happen, right? Because nobody's getting plays produced in Chicago anymore, and that was a little discouraging, I suppose. But so I would love to plug something here, but unfortunately, that'll have to wait till society resumes.
I relate to that, dude. 2020 was like going to be my year. Like literally November and December, I was like, I got all the money saved. I got everything that I need to do. I got all these plans. And then it's just like, no.
Mhm.
So now I'm substitute teaching in Missouri, which is not what I expected.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear more about that sometime. I'm not sure this is the proper venue for it, but
Well, you're right, because even though it's for an English class at the time being, there's no books being discussed in that class, which is a crying shame.
what is being discussed?
Well, they're like in the middle of enrollment and things like that, so they're just doing like a lot of administrative stuff for next year. But
Oh, okay.
yeah, we could chat after. I'll stop recording and I'll fill you in. I don't want the district.
I got nowhere to go, man.
Cool. Well, basically, everybody, that was Rick Homuth here, dramaturg extraordinaire. Yeah, I guess you're not a dramaturg. What do you call it? A playwright. There
Playwright.
you go.
We'll go with playwright.
Playwright. If only there was a word for it.
Impresario.
Impresario. Maestro Homuth.
There you
And
go.
Pringle was chatting through most of that. So hopefully something within all of that will help you write better stories. Goodbye.
Absolutely.